Almost 20 years ago, I learned that Reno, Nevada is actually farther west than Los Angeles, California, where I grew up. That one fact made me realize that the mental map I carried around in my head wasn't nearly as accurate as I thought, so I went down a rabbit hole looking for other geography facts that completely changed the way I looked at maps. I even wrote an article with 20 of my favorites back then, and over the years I've found quite a few more. I'm Roger from priceoftravel.com, and here are 23 geography facts that sound wrong until you look at a map. Here's one that surprised me about two of my favorite cities. When I think of Venice, I picture an Italian coastal city. When I think of Montreal, I picture one of Canada's northernmost major cities with long, snowy winters. But when you look at a map, they're almost exactly the same distance from the equator. If you've ever sailed through the Panama Canal, or even just visited the Miraflores locks, you probably already know this one. Crossing from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean sounds like it should mean traveling east. But because of the shape of the Isthmus of Panama, ships actually travel mostly northwest. And here's another surprise, the canal isn't 50 miles of locks. There are only 2 sets of locks, with most of the journey crossing the enormous artificial Lake Gatun in the middle. Here's one I still have trouble believing. Growing up in the western US, I always thought of Atlanta as basically an East Coast city, while Detroit felt like upper Midwest, several states inland from the Atlantic. But when you look at a map, Atlanta is actually farther west than Detroit. Not by much, but enough that my mental map was definitely wrong. My childhood mental map was pretty simple. North America and Europe were in the northern hemisphere, and South America and Africa were in the southern hemisphere. But of course, if you actually look where the equator lies, it turns out that much of South America is north of the equator, and most of Africa is too. Once you see that, it suddenly makes sense that around 90% of the world's population lives in the northern hemisphere. Speaking of Africa, when you see photos or videos of the Great Pyramids of Giza, especially from certain angles, they look like they're out in the middle of the Sahara Desert. But not only are they way up in the northern hemisphere, they're on almost the exact same latitude as muggy Houston, Texas. It's another reminder that latitude doesn't determine what a place looks like or feels like. If you grew up around the Great Lakes, this probably isn't going to surprise you, but growing up in the western US, I always pictured Canada as simply being north of the United States because that's what the border looks like across Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Then I finally looked closely at the Great Lakes and realized that the border takes a huge dip to the south. In fact, Toronto is actually a little farther south than Portland, Oregon. Here's another one for anyone who's been to New Zealand. Most visitors fly into Auckland on the North Island before making their way down to the spectacular South Island. So you'd naturally expect the ferry to head south, but the ferry between Wellington and Picton actually travels mostly north. It's another reminder that coastlines and islands don't always line up the way our mental maps tell us they should. Here's one that's kind of silly, but I bet I'm not the only one. For years I pictured North America sitting on top of Central America, which sat on top of South America. It just seemed to make sense. But when you look at a map, you realize that Central America actually runs mostly west to east, and almost all of South America is actually east of Florida. Most geography buffs probably know that Greenland is the world's largest island, and most people know it isn't nearly as huge as it looks on many maps because it's so far north. But here's the part that surprised me. Greenland really is enormous. It's actually about 10% larger than Mexico. But Greenland is about 10% smaller than Algeria, so Algeria is about 20% larger than Mexico. I never would have guessed that. I'm not sure how native Europeans picture this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not the only American who generally thinks of Europe as just across the Atlantic to the east. But when you look at a map, it gets a lot stranger than that. A big chunk of Africa is actually east of the southern United States, and Europe is almost completely east of Canada, including the Northwest Territories. And here's the part that really surprised me. London is about 300 miles, or around 500 kilometers, north of the northern tip of Maine. Another one that surprised me involves Britain and France. Whenever I flew across the Atlantic, I'd picture reaching Britain first, then crossing the English Channel, and finally arriving in France. But when you actually look at a map, Britain is pretty much due north of France, and the western tip of France reaches much farther into the Atlantic than I realized. In fact, it's west of almost all of Britain. If you're watching from Britain or France, this one probably isn't much of a surprise, but in my mental map, Britain was always west of France. For some reason, if you asked me to draw a map of the United States from memory, I'd probably draw Maine sticking way up in the northeast, almost like it's farther north than everything else. But once again, my mental map was wrong. Portland, Oregon is actually a little farther north than Portland, Maine, and much farther north than Boston. Even stranger, the northern border of California extends farther north than Rhode Island and even parts of Canada. When you're standing on the beach in San Diego, that almost seems impossible. Here's another one that still feels strange to me. Chicago, Barcelona, and Istanbul could hardly feel more different in almost every way. And I have to admit, for years I pictured Istanbul as being much farther south, almost tucked into the Middle East. But when you look at a map, Chicago, Barcelona, and Istanbul are all on almost the exact same latitude. Here's another one that surprised me. Athens feels like one of Europe's hottest and driest major cities, and if you've ever visited in the middle of summer, you might start sweating just thinking about it. So it still seems strange to me that Athens shares almost the exact same latitude as San Francisco, a city famous for cool summers, fog, and people wearing jackets in July. Thanks partly to the Gulf Stream and the broader North Atlantic current system, Western Europe stays much milder than its latitude would suggest. And that can fool people like me. When I picture Cannes, Nice, and Monaco on France's sun-soaked southern coast, it still doesn't feel possible that they're on roughly the same latitude as Toronto. But when you look at a map, there they are. Here's one that's more of a travel observation than a geography fact. After visiting Australia, I've always thought that Sydney felt like the Los Angeles of Australia, with a modern skyline, gorgeous beaches, and endless suburban sprawl. Meanwhile, Melbourne has always reminded me much more of San Francisco, with its historic center and an artsier vibe. So I was amused to discover that Sydney and Los Angeles are almost exactly the same distance from the equator, and Melbourne and San Francisco are almost exactly the same distance as well. And no, I'm not saying latitude is what makes them feel similar, I just thought it was a fun coincidence. One thing you quickly learn when looking for surprising facts on maps is that latitude and climate aren't as closely related as most of us think, but sometimes they really are. If you've traveled a lot, you might have noticed that Los Angeles, Cape Town, Buenos Aires, and Sydney all have remarkably pleasant climates. None are too hot or too cold for most of the year. It turns out that's not a coincidence. All four cities sit almost exactly the same distance from the equator. Maybe there really is a sweet spot. I've also lived on the East Coast quite a bit over the years, and I'm not immune to getting things wrong there either. This is one that many of you have probably heard before, but it still doesn't sound possible. The closest part of the United States to Africa isn't in Florida or anywhere close, it's actually in Maine. Again, even though I grew up along the coast of Southern California, this one is still hard for me to believe. Whenever I picture the West Coast in my mind, it feels like one long north-south line, so Los Angeles just seems like it has to be closer to Hawaii than San Francisco. But when you look at a map, San Francisco is actually closer. Here's another one that surprised me, and I think part of it is because of the way most maps distort the size of countries. Even when you're looking at a map of Western Europe, France doesn't look all that much larger than England. But when you actually compare the sizes, England is a little bit smaller than the state of Louisiana. Even if you add Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the entire United Kingdom is still a wee bit smaller than Michigan. Meanwhile, France isn't just larger than California, it's about 30% larger, which also means that France is almost 5 times the size of England. Years ago, while putting together an article for priceoftravel.com listing the latitudes of major cities around the world, I kept running into pairings that surprised me. One of my favorites is Beijing and the Spanish island of Ibiza. One is famous for imperial palaces, freezing winters, and nearly 22 million people. The other is famous for Mediterranean beaches, beach clubs, and around 160,000 residents, yet they're almost perfectly lined up on the globe. I've spent a lot of time in both India and Mexico, and over the years I noticed they have a lot in common. They're famous for warm weather, beautiful beaches, colorful cities, incredible street food, and dishes that can be as spicy as you can handle. Then I realized there's a good reason they feel so similar. If you line them up on a map, India and Mexico overlap surprisingly closely in latitude. It's not the whole story, of course, but it certainly helps explain why the climates in much of the two countries feel surprisingly similar. Finally, growing up in Southern California, I knew Hawaii was about a 5-hour flight from Los Angeles, so I always pictured it way out in the middle of the Pacific, somewhere around Central America. But it's actually only a little farther south than Cabo San Lucas. Then I flew home from Tahiti one year, a flight of more than 4,000 miles, and I naturally assumed Tahiti must be far southwest of Hawaii. Nope, Tahiti and Bora Bora are actually east of Hawaii. So those are 23 geography facts that surprised me over the years, and hopefully at least a few of them surprised you too. Let me know in the comments which one surprised you the most, or if you've got another favorite geography fact that should have made this list. I usually make travel videos here on the channel, so if you enjoy this kind of travel and geography content, I'd love to have you subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.